infectious diseases. This first lecture is a brief history of infectious diseases, and it begins with the ominous image of a plague physician from the 1720 plague in Marseille, France. So this individual is covered in a long leather gown, gloves, and has a stick to poke away sick individuals that try to get near him, and a very ominous looking bird-like mask with a beak full of herbs because of the foul stench of death from the plague. And then to show that these individuals don't really have a good sense of science and scientific method or even medicine in general, they have this outfit has crystalline eyes that are intended to ward off evil spirits. So a little bit of background on the plague. There were three major plagues, but as I show here, there are quite a few intervening plagues. A few in Italy and Vienna and Marseille and Moscow, for example. But the three main ones include the first pandemic, which was the plague of Justinian, that hit the Eastern Roman Empire centered in Constantinople, and that it was believed to have killed about 25 million individuals, very dense populations of societies back then. And this particular piece of information from some medical literature that happened after this event, but it was sort of a retrospective, suggested that this was indeed a bubonic plague, and that there was swelling in the glands in the manner of a nut or date. And so those are characteristic signs of bubonic plague. The second pandemic, which was also called the Black Death, happened in the 14th century and spread from southwestern Asia to Europe. And that was believed to have killed roughly a third or three-quarters of the population of Europe, for example, but certainly didn't just hang around in Europe. It killed probably 75 to 100 million people across Eurasia. These are some pictures representative of the bubonic plague. And so what you see here are illustrations, these individuals having boo-boos all over their body, which looks to be a little bit of hyperbole to me, because typically the bubonic plague will focus buboes in particular areas. For example, these are inguinal buboes that would be most likely the result of an individual being bitten by a flea somewhere in this region, in your legs, for example. So wherever the closest lymph nodes are to where you were bitten is typically where you're inflamed. So if you're bitten in the neck, your neck might swell. If you're bitten in the torso, then the axillary area might swell. So axillary being here in your armpits, for example. The third pandemic was centered in China in 1855, and this was a time frame when microbiology was starting to become a very exciting science with the work of Koch and Pasteur. And so at this time, a microbiologist by the name of Alexandre Yersin isolated the etiologic agent, in this particular case, Yersinia pestis, and established the rat flea, this guy here, as the primary vector. And so presumably what was happening is that the fleas were feeding heavily on infected rodents and then occasionally jumping onto humans and then spreading the bacteria accordingly. More recently, we discovered that there was sort of an evolutionary event, a series of evolutionary events that took place that allowed Yersinia pseudotuberculosis to evolve into Yersinia pestis. These are very similar organisms, and it was always confusing to me when I looked through the genetics literature that these organisms basically seemed like the same thing. I couldn't even tell what the difference was. And then a more recent paper came out and sort of explained the difference. So in this particular case, Yersinia pseudotuberculosis colonizes the hindgut of the flea. And after a period of time, through genetic rearrangements, gains some genes. And one of the genes that it gains is a phospholipase gene, And so this phospholipase gene allows the microbes to, who knows what, possibly take advantage of some nutrients that can be found in abundance in the midgut. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that the phospholipase genes allow the microbes to digest some kind of antimicrobial compounds that are here. But either way, the gain of this phospholipase gene allowed the bacteria to move from the hindgut into this midgut, and then eventually these bacteria lose some particular genes, and the loss of these genes allow them to enhance biofilm formation. And so the genes probably are some kind of repressor for biofilm formation, for example. And so by losing these genes, the repressor is gone, and now they become a strain of bacteria that has a really good biofilm producing capability. And so the microbe will then form really pronounced biofilms in this foregut region, or proventriculus as it's called. And so as the microbes build up and stick to the tissue here, they actually can clog the esophagus and proventriculus of the flea, causing the flea to essentially starve. And so as the flea starves because it's choking, it feeds more. And every time it takes a bite out of somebody, it regurgitates some of this biofilm into the bite. And so the ingenious way of Yersinia pseudotuberculosis evolving into Y. pestis and spreading itself is illustrated in this genetic series. And again, this flea would normally feed, fill its little belly up, and then drop off and not need to eat again for a long time. However, if this flea has a clogged proventriculus, the flea will be biting like crazy trying to eat, and so it'll bite, hundreds of individuals in a dense population, and still not be satisfied. But all the while, will amplify the spread of Yersinia pestis. This slide overviews some of the ecology of plague, and so you're looking at two different cycles: the sylvatic cycle of spread and the urban cycle of spread, and then three different forms of the disease. So in this particular case, in the sylvatic spread, we're just talking about wildlife, spreading of Yersinia pestis between wild rodents. Again, these can be prairie dogs or brown squirrels. And so here you see the flea acting as a vector for the bacteria between wild rodents. And then occasionally there's direct contact between some kind of domestic rodent, like a rat, for example, in a city, and a flea. And so the flea jumps ship from a wild rodent to the domestic rodent, and then creates the so-called urban cycle. And then obviously individuals can come in contact with these wild or domesticated rodents. In either case, the fleas could jump off a domesticated rodent or jump off a wild rodent and cause the symptoms of bubonic plague. And there you see the black dots representing places where buboes would most likely form, depending on where the individual was bitten. Bubonic plague can spread from buboes, these lymph nodes, into the bloodstream and become septicemic or septicemia plague. And that's obviously a very deadly form, because once your body goes septicemic, it creates a whole bunch of inflammatory responses that can kill you in and of themselves. And so going from septicemic, then the microbes can actually concentrate in the lungs. And here represents the third phase, the pneumonic plague version. And so in the pneumonic plague version, this individual here can actually sneeze or cough microbes into this individual. So this is where person-to-person contact can become a problem. Whereas bubonic plague is not spread person-to-person. And septicemic plague is not spread person-to-person. So only when the bacterium concentrates in the lungs can be spread person-to-person. So this is an interesting little funny bit of history, the flying corpses of Kaffa. And essentially what it's about is this walled city of Kaffa, which was a big trading port essentially, and a lot of merchants from Venice and so forth would collect here and do a lot of trading. And this area was all under control by Mongols or Mongolian tribes, and so but there was a reason why they would want this area, because this fort, which was located here in present-day Feodosia, which here's Kaffa, but it gave you control, essentially trading control of the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, and then all into Asia. And so individuals wanted to control this port, and there was a sort of a disagreement or argument. I don't know how to explain it better than that, between the Tartars or Mongols and the merchants that had established this colony of Kaffa, and this walled city, I guess, is a better way to say it. And so obviously these the being incapable of resolving the issues any other way, the Mongols came and laid siege to this walled city. And so here's a representation of the walled city. And it was sort of a stalemate, because the city was so fortified that the Mongols couldn't really breach the defenses. But what happened was the Mongols ended up having an outbreak of plague in their ranks, and thousands were dying. And so they decided to call off the siege. It was a long siege, by the way, I think years-long siege. But anyway, they called off the siege eventually, but not before lobbing a bunch of catapulting plague-ridden bodies into the city in order to, I don't know, thumb their nose at them for winning the fight, winning the standoff, I guess. And in that process, the individuals inside the city had to dispose of all those bodies, and it's thought that those individuals then came in contact with the plague bacteria, and eventually, if they left the port and went back to their home after the siege, now that they could travel more freely, they must have brought the plague bacteria with them, in the form of, that asymptomatic period that we all hear about with COVID-19, asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic phase before they, developed bubonic or pneumonic plague. And so a map of at least of the water routes of the plague spread is indicated here. And so here's Kaffa. Now it's spelled with a C here, but here's Kaffa. Here's the Sea of Azov. There's a little community, little city called Tana here that there was also an important strategic trading point. But you can see how that just opens right up to Asia and the Middle East. And so again, it's a really crucial port. Now, plague spread in the overland route as well, but the problem is it's not as quick. Whereas, by boat, you see here's the Sea of Azov. Here's the Black Sea, and then you go right into the Aegean and Mediterranean, and then you're have free access to all these rich trading ports, Genoa, Venice, and so forth. Here's Marseille in France, and then basically Spain, and then right through the Straits of Gibraltar into England, for example. So not surprisingly, the plague spread fairly quickly after that siege. And so even today, and this isn't exactly current data, but it's still pretty accurate. The World Health Organization reports 1,000 to 3,000 cases of the plague worldwide. And here you can see regions where plague occurs in animals. So the whole western half of the United States has bacteria. I'm sorry, rodents that contain plague bacteria. And we often do testing for this. Even in our department, there's some faculty that look at this kind of thing. And there are actually actual reported cases of plague. And we've actually had here in San Luis Obispo County, have had reported cases of plague in the last 10 years. Not many, and they're obviously easily treated these days with antibiotics.